Kia ora,
Kia
and
ora.
welcome along to this Rainbow Walk Tour. My name is Gareth.
And I'm Roger.
And together we're...
Roger and Gareth.
Or Gareth and Roger.
Whichever you prefer.
It's so lovely to have you on this very special walk tour. Roger and I have been doing these tours physically since 2017, but because of the COVID situation, we can't obviously have groups at the moment. So we thought a great way of doing it would be to do it as a virtual walk tour. And today is even more special because this is especially for the MBIE Rainbow Network. And just a huge thank you for inviting us along to do this presentation for you. We're not actually logged into YouTube. We have got quite a slow computer here, and so we're not quite sure. We know it's broadcasting, but we're not quite sure if you're actually there. So if you do want to contact us, please use the email address below. That's walks@taonga.nz. You're more than welcome to write in and say hello or share your thoughts. We had one just before we came online, which was from Paul, who says, what does he say? He says, you guys are cracking me up, hilarious. Which we weren't trying to, but there you go. Yeah, so maybe just a couple of thank yous first of all.
Yeah, well, thank you first of all to you for coming along on this tour with us, but also to Alison Laurie and Hugh Young, who've done quite a lot of research into rainbow history of Wellington, and we've drawn on some of that for this tour.
Great. So the tour's going to last around about 50 minutes, and as I say, you're more than welcome to say hi as we go along. But to get things started, let's just give you an idea of where we are located.
So the tour is beginning in Taro in Wellington, the inner city suburb of Taro, where the yellow dot is. The whole tour, in fact, takes place within Taro, and Taro means the facing, and it was thought to have been named by a local iwi, Ngātiawa, one of the local iwi, Ngātiawa, in reference to facing Mount Taranaki from where they travelled. The Maori settlements dominated Wellington up until the arrival in 1840 of the New Zealand Company. Now, the New Zealand Company's objective was the systematic colonisation of New Zealand, and they began dividing up land for European settlement. Taro was one of the early areas to be settled because it was flat, and there still exists now quite a collection of historic buildings up the top end of Cuba Street, which date from the early settlements, from about the 1860s, some of the buildings. But we start our tour where the yellow dot is here, outside this building, which has a lovely shop window, display window at the front there. It's from a bit later, it's from about 1900, 1901. And for its first few decades, it was a dry cleaners in Wellington, and then had a variety of occupants up until the 1970s, when it was occupied by Carmen Rupe, and Carmen had her Carmen's Curios here, and you can see that display window as it was in the 70s with Carmen's shop, and it has the wonderful window surrounds there, sort of Arabian Nights exotic surrounds for the window. Is very reminiscent of the design for Carmen's International Coffee Lounge, which we'll hear quite a bit more about a wee bit later. And that was in Vivian Street. But who was Carmen Rupe? Well, Carmen was a performer, a sex worker, an entrepreneur, as well as being an activist, particularly around HIV causes and anti-discrimination. There's a great photo here of Carmen from the 1960s titled Kiwi Carmen. Carmen was born in Tauranui in 1936, and she later lived in both Auckland and Wellington. She first began drag performance while she was in the military, doing compulsory military service in the 1950s. Now you may wonder what the connection is between the military and drag, but in fact the New Zealand Armed Forces have quite a history of drag performance, particularly with the various concert parties that entertained the troops in the Second World War and later. Here's a great image of Ralph Dyer, also known as Marlena Heatrash, performing in New Caledonia in 1943. Now, there are a number of other performers that would still have been talked about when Carmen was doing her military service in the 1950s. So after her military service, Carmen moved to Sydney's King's Cross and became Australia's first Maori drag performer, and from that time on she identified as transsexual. In 1967 she moved back to Wellington and established her international coffee lounge, the Le Balcon Cabaret, an Egyptian tea room just down the road, a massage parlour and a brothel. She also established the curio shop that we're out the front of now. Now Carmen's life was filled with curios, and there's a wonderful shot here of her living room when she was in Sydney a wee bit later, showing all her knickknacks.
It's such an amazing collection of just Carmen. It's quite incredible. Quite a number of those taonga in that image have ended up at Te Papa. Carmen hand-selected some items and then gifted them to Te Papa before she died in 2011. Well, one of Carmen's many achievements was winning a landmark court case in 1966, which was about the right to wear female clothing in public. So prior to this time, prior to 1966, New Zealand newspapers are peppered with stories about people being taken to court for just simply wearing female clothing in public. Well, January 1966, Carmen was arrested in Auckland with, quote, behaving in an offensive manner, and the offensive manner was that she was wearing a skirt, stockings and high heel shoes. But she wasn't really having a bar of that charge, and she said she was going to go to court and defend it. So Carmen turns up at court and the police say, go home and change into male clothing. And she said, no, you caught me as a woman and I'm going to court as a woman. And yeah, quite a remarkable stand. So the judge in this case, Justice McCarthy, not only dismissed the case, but also in his decision notes said, quote, he was quite unable to find anything in our law which says that it's unlawful for a male to attire himself in female clothing. And that was a real watershed moment here in New Zealand. So Carmen was a trailblazer, and she also was, I think, kind of well ahead of her time. She advocated for homosexual law reform, which happened in 1985, 1986, but she was talking about that in the early 1970s. And she also, in the 1970s, advocated for prostitution law reform, which happened in 2003. We're going to be talking a wee bit more about prostitution law reform at our next stop on the tour, but I should just say that we've had some correspondence in. Robert says, yes, you are live and still hilarious.
Thanks, Robert.
Bless you. We're not
doing our best.
We're not trying to be hilarious, but thank you. But let's move on to our next stop quickly. So we're at the red dot and we're going to the yellow dot, which is just a couple of doors down.
Yeah, so this sort of fairly unremarkable looking building was in fact the first location of the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, who opened there in 1988. Now the collective was formed in 1987 by a diverse group of sex industry workers, and they had the aim of providing support and education. Shortly after forming, they were contracted by the Ministry of Health to provide a range of services focusing on HIV/AIDS prevention. The collective shared this space with the National People Living with AIDS Union, which was based here from 1988 until the early 1990s. And it was also the home of Wellington's first needle exchange program. Now, right from the start, the collective was a driving force for prostitution law reform. And that call was taken up by the Labour MP Tim Barnett, who introduced the Prostitution Law Reform Bill into Parliament in 2000. The purpose of the law reform was to enable sex workers to have the same rights and protections afforded to other workers in other industries. In June 2003, New Zealand became the first country in the world to decriminalise sex work. Prior to this, sex work hadn't been explicitly illegal, but there were a range of offences surrounding this that could be committed in association with acts of prostitution, including the 1908 Act, which said that from that time anyone who was keeping a common bawdy house for the purposes of prostitution along with its tenants was liable for 2 years imprisonment with hard labour.
Now, the reason we got a little bit lost there was because I was trying to delete something on one computer and I was obviously hitting the wrong keyboard, and it was on the keyboard on the image that you were seeing on the screen, so I apologise for that. We're just trying to get the image back up on the screen. That will work. A question that's come in from Michael was, where is Carmen buried? Is she buried in Wellington? My understanding is that she's buried just out of Sydney, Australia.
So. Yeah.
Yes, it's either in Sydney or just outside of Sydney.
That's where she died, and I think she's buried there too. Yeah.
Well, just getting back to prostitution reform, and surprise, surprise, even though prostitution was illegal, it still happened. That's true. So sometimes quietly, but also sometimes quite blatantly. And an example of that is Carmen's International Coffee Lounge, which was on Vivian Street, just next door to the Salvation Army Citadel. Great neighbours. So the Carmen's International Coffee Lounge was 2 stories. On the ground floor we had the coffee lounge, and upstairs we had the rooms for sex work. And what would happen is that clients would come in and have a cup of coffee or tea with Carmen downstairs, and depending on how they placed their cup and saucer, told Carmen what kind of liaison they were interested in. So a cup placed on its side was for a transgender liaison, a cup placed upside down was for a heterosexual liaison, and a saucer placed on top of a cup was for a homosexual liaison. And then Carmen could work out what kind of liaison was required, and would arrange with the sex worker, who would go upstairs, and then the client would actually leave the coffee lounge, go outside, and go up a back entrance. Apparently Carmen had a really fantastic line for male patrons who were giving her a bit of jib. She would say, "Do you want a fuck or a fight? Because I can give you both."
Great line.
Great line. Okay, we're going to move now. Oh, just before we do, I'm just going to take you back to the image of where the Prostitutes Collective was. That was built in 1920 on the outside there, the outside of the building. Behind it is a real lovely gem in Cuba Street, and it was built in 1860. And it's this wonderful 2-story cottage, and it's the oldest building in the Cuba Street area. And what we're looking at here is Cuba Street is behind this building, so we're looking towards Cuba Street. A lovely hidden gem. Came up on the open market a couple of years ago, and this is where that image is from.
Real cutie.
Okay, moving on to our next stop now. We're going from the red dot and we're going up to the yellow dot, so we're just going northwards a bit.
So we've just crossed State Highway 1 and the bypass there. The bypass was responsible for the movement of a number of historic buildings up the top end of Cuba Street, including this 2-storied industrial commercial building there, which this is a photo of it back in the day, and actually it's on the other side of the road from where it was, and it was moved in the construction of the bypass.
And there's actually a wonderful image. So this is what it used to look like, and you'll see that there's the single story on the left hand side. This is where it is now, so obviously the 2-story building's on the left, but those single story buildings are on the right, and that yellow dot is one of the buildings, and that yellow dot actually is Carmen's Egyptian tea room.
So Carmen had lots of businesses up this end of town. The reason why we wanted to draw your attention to the commercial buildings there, the ones on the left, the brown ones there, they are typical of the kind of architecture from around the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century. They were designed by the architects Thomas Turnbull and his son William, who were very prominent architects in Wellington at the turn of the century. Thomas was born in Scotland in 1824, but eventually made his way to New Zealand, and he and his son designed a number of buildings around Wellington, which still exist, and we'll see a few more of them on this tour. Probably one of their most notable buildings is this one here. This is Turnbull House, and it's on Bowen Street. It's a particularly beautiful sort of historic residence, really. And you may be thinking, Turnbull House, is that named after the architects? No, it's not. In fact, it's named after the owner, Alexander Turnbull. And in fact, the Turnbull architects and Alexander Turnbull, the families were not related at all.
And you may also be going, for Alexander Turnbull, because there's a photo of a very dashing, shall we say, Alexander Turnbull.
Great moustache.
Great moustache. Now, he was a merchant and book collector, and he was born in Wellington in 1868, but moved to London with his family in 1875. But then he returned to Wellington in his early 20s, which I find quite interesting. In 1915, Turnbull House was built as his residence and as a place to store his large collection of books, documents, manuscripts, photographs, 55,000 items approximately in total. Unfortunately, Alexander died in 1918, just a couple of years after Turnbull House was built, and he died after complications following surgery on his sinuses. Before his death, he bequeathed his entire collection to the nation, and this is where we get the first national collection in New Zealand, the Alexander Turnbull collection, which is now part of the National Library, the Alexander Turnbull Library. Now, apparently, in early gay circles, Alexander was known, quote, as to be a screaming queen, but I think other biographers have not been able to find any evidence that he was a screaming queen, although well, I'm not sure what evidence you'd need.
What the smoking gun would be. He never married.
He never.
That's good enough for you. I don't know.
Well, that's good enough for us, you know. Yeah. Let's move on. Okay, so we're moving on from Alexander Turnbull, and we're actually moving northwards up Cuba Street. And so on the red dot is where we are, and we're going to the yellow dot, which is northwards, and it's the People's Palace. And the People's Palace is this wonderful 4-story building on our right. Now, this was built by the Salvation Army, and this building has a number of construction dates. 1904, which is on the left-hand side, it's the smaller part on the far left, and then 1916 and 2003. Now, the Salvation Army built people's palaces in both New Zealand and Australia in the early part of last century as a way of offering liquor-free cheap accommodation. To quote from the army, it was to assist the fallen and suffering brothers and sisters and to rescue outcasts. Now, if we had been staying there in 1894, we wouldn't have seen this structure, but we would have seen an earlier structure that had again been built by the Salvation Army, and that was the Paulina Rescue Home. And if we'd been staying there in 1894, we could easily have come across a young Eugene Fellini, and here's a police mugshot of Eugene.
Yeah, the fact that there is a police mugshot, in fact, of Eugene tells a bit of a story, and we'll get onto that in a moment. Eugene was born in 1875 in Italy and came to New Zealand at the age of 2 with his family. Now, he was the eldest of 22 children, 17 of whom survived into adulthood, so it was a huge family. Eugene was working at Murphy's Brickworks in Taranaki Street when he was taken to court for impersonating a man. Now, around the age of 21, he ran away to sea in 1895. He was raped multiple times by the ship's captain and had a baby in Sydney in 1898. Staying in Sydney, he changed his name to Harry Crawford and married twice, and was one of those wives that he was charged and eventually convicted of murdering in 1920. Now, the evidence for the murder conviction is pretty circumstantial by today's standards, and the evidence is pretty flimsy. Nevertheless, he was convicted and imprisoned. He died sadly in 1938 after being released from prison and then stepping out off the pavement and accidentally into the path of an oncoming car.
Well, just a wee bit further down from the People's Palace, we're at the red dot, and we're just going to the corner, which is the yellow dot, and that is now Ombra. You may be familiar with that. But back in the day, it was built in 1922, and back in the day it was called the Morgans Building. And the Morgans Building has had a number of occupants, and here's a photo from the 1970s, just showing the kind of the corner of the building. Just to point out that on the ground floor from 1937 was Anthony Janis, a hairdresser. And you may, if you are from Wellington, you may recall George Janis, and George Janis has had multiple hair salons in Wellington over the decades and is a really well-known business person in Wellington. Well, George started here in 1953 with his father, and I've got to say, I'm so looking forward to a haircut. I'm so looking forward to a haircut. I think this is the longest I've had without a haircut. It's like, oh my God, 6 weeks. Anyway, back to the sign. Also, we have on the first floor the Striptease sign, and the Striptease sign here is advertising a striptease called Club Exotic, later to be renamed Club Exotique.
Yeah, in fact, that sign was there for years and years, actually long after it was a strip club. But Club Exotique was owned by Emmanuel Papadopoulos, and the famous New Zealand actor and entertainer and percussionist Bruno Lawrence used to work there, and he would accompany the girls stripping, not stripping himself, he would perform fanfares and drum rolls in accompaniment to their stripping. Carmen worked here from the 1960s, and Georgina Bayer worked here from the 1970s. And talking about this, a few years ago, Georgina said of working at Club Exotic, the only queens that got to work in clubs and do the full-on stripping had to be extraordinarily good-looking and unspringable. The exploitation was horrendous in lots of ways, but better to be inside a strip club on a cold, wet, windy Wellington night than stuck out on the corner trying to pick up a client. She also said, I'd finished doing a spot up at the Club Exotic, race downstairs in my bra and panties and perhaps with a fabulous cape on, and sort of fly across Vivian Street to get to the Purple Onion to fill in and do a spot there. Now, the Purple Onion was Wellington's first drag club, and it was located just next to where the Subway shop is on Vivian Street now.
Just before we go on as well, again, just reiterating, if you would like to say hello or you have a question, please feel free to, or if you have a story, please feel free to email us at walks.taonga.nz, and I think I've got my keyboards sorted out now, so I won't delete the slides. Oh God. Georgina Bayer. Now, Georgina has had an amazing life story thus far. Here's a lovely photo of Georgina from the 1990s. Georgina was born in Wellington in 1957, and she lived in the Wellington region for some time before moving with her mother and brother up to Auckland. So while in Auckland and at high school, she discovered acting and drama, and she won the College Cup for Drama in 1972. And then pretty soon after that, actually left school and came back to Wellington, and then worked in the Cuba Street area in the sex and entertainment industries. In the mid-80s, she was nominated in the National Film and Television Awards for Best Actress in a Dramatic Role. And then in the 1990s, she moved into politics, and this is where that photo comes from. This is Georgina when she was elected Mayor of Carterton District. So the Carterton District's just north of Wellington, and it was significant both nationally and internationally because Georgina was the first openly transgender person in the world to hold a mayoralty, which is really fantastic. In the late 90s, she moved into national politics and again became the first openly transgender person in the world to become a member of Parliament. And again, this is really fantastic and a trailblazing. So Georgina, while in Parliament, fought for civil unions and also prostitution law reform, and both of those things happened in 2003, 2004, and so it was great to get that legislation through. There's one other thing that we just need to say before we move on to our next stop, and that is there's lovely traffic lights on Cuba Street with the iconic image of Carmen on the green pedestrian traffic light, and they were put in place by former Mayor Celia Wade Brown in 2016. So there are a number of places on Cuba Street when you go to cross as a pedestrian, you get to see Carmen, and it's just such a lovely thing every day to come down and see Carmen kind of blazing out like that. We're just going to move on to our next stop now, and just a content warning that our next stop is dealing with a local hate crime and is a little bit graphic. But we're going from the red Ombre building up to, we're going eastwards to the yellow dot, and that is, it looks like a car park there. In fact, it's the service station on Vivian Street.
Well, early in the morning of the 8th of May, 1999, 14-year-old Jeff Whittington is sitting on the curb of this petrol station. He's had a night out, he's drunk, and he's high. At 4:20 AM, a police officer talks to Jeff. He says he's okay, and so the officer leaves. Well, also out drinking that night were two men in their 20s, Stephen Smith and Jason Meads. And by chance, they drive by Jeff here at the petrol station. Now, he's a complete stranger to them. The two men stop and start talking to Jeff, and all three eventually wind up a short drive away in the Aro Valley, smoking a joint. Now, it's here that Stephen and Jason beat Jeff to death. The pair boast to acquaintances later that they've beaten up a faggot who'd been wearing makeup. They tell their acquaintances that they'd never seen anyone bleed from the places that he bled from. Well, Stephen and Jason admit to punching and kicking him, but they deny stomping on his head, and they say that they never meant to kill him. Jeff suffers severe brain damage, has boot marks on his skin, and has a ruptured bowel. A woman finds him alone, lying in a puddle at 4:40 AM, and he dies in hospital the next day. Well, the jury convicted both Stephen and Jason of murder, and they were sentenced to life imprisonment. Jason was released from prison in 2013, and Stephen was freed on parole in April 2017. Now, he's been released on 3 previous occasions and recalled to prison each time.
Well, the horrific murder of Jeff happened just 8 months after the killing of Matthew Shepard in Wyoming in the USA. And both murders had a really marked impact on a lot of people, including local playwright Ronald Trefero Nelson, who wrote the play Corner 4 AM and Cuba, looking at the events around Jeff's death. A few years ago, Ronald said in an interview that the first season, or the only season of the play, which happened at Bats Theatre in Wellington, which is quite an intimate theatre, I think it holds about 100 people-ish. That season, they invited both Jeff's family and the perpetrators' families, and he was saying that they all attended, but just what a tense night of theatre it was. I can't imagine what that would have been like. Yeah. Yeah, we've had a question in from Richard, who's asking, do we know when the oldest gay bar or meeting space opened in Wellington? And that's a really good question. We are going to be talking about the Dorian Society a little later on, which might have been one of the early groups that met. And there were certainly public bars that people were meeting at in the 60s and 70s, and coffee lounges. So, for instance, things like Carmen's coffee lounge, I should say. Yeah, so we'll talk about the Dorian Society a bit later on, but I can't think of any specific examples.
There were probably early pubs and things that were known as meeting places, but not specifically gay bars or whatever. Yeah, thinking of around the Midland Hotel sort of era.
Yes, and I think in those earlier times, so we're talking, 1940s and 50s, there would have been a lot of dinner parties in private houses. So I think it was a lot more private. And the bars, our understanding is that the bars were happening in the 60s and 70s, coming out of meetings and coffee lounges. And things like that. And also remember that bars at that time were a lot more restrictive in terms of hours and sale of liquor. So we'll move to our next stop now, which is going from the red dot. We're going northeast to the yellow dot, and the yellow dot is on Willis Street, and the yellow dot being St. Peter's Church on Willis Street, a lovely, lovely church. And this church was actually built by Thomas Turnbull, the architect who we've been talking about earlier on. It was built in 1879, but there was actually an earlier church structure that was on this site just 7 years after European settlement. So in 1847, this is the first St. Peter's Church, and the part on the left is the original church. The part on the right with the circular window is built in 1866. So this church, St. Peter's, pretty much as soon as it was built, was used as temporary accommodation following the devastating Marlborough 7.4 earthquake in 1848. By the 1870s, the church had seen a lot of modifications and was described in 1870 as a large, straggling, disproportionate, shapeless, hideous deformity. And so a replacement church was planned, and this is where we get this one from the 1870s, late 1870s.
Well, the reason that we're here is that in June 1967, the Reverend Godfrey Wilson delivered a sermon highlighting the negative treatment of homosexuals. Now, this was a radical call for acceptance and inclusion at that time. When you think about it, that was 20 years before homosexual law reform in New Zealand, and so many people of the time in the late 60s would have thought of homosexuality as a perversion and not a matter of human rights. And on that note, here's a clipping from the 1960s, about the same time, 1967. It's a newspaper article from Detective Superintendent F.A. Gordon, or FAG for short. In it, he asks the people of Christchurch, do we want our cities overrun with pimps, ponces, pansies, pussyfoots and perverts? Well, today the answer to that could well be yes, but in 1967 the answer would have been a resounding no. Now, the Reverend Godfrey's sympathetic sermon was broadcast on national radio, and it was probably the first sermon of its kind in New Zealand. The core of the sermon was about a man named John, who's talking to a prison chaplain. John is in prison because of his homosexuality. John says to the chaplain, if you fall in love and marry, well, that's fine. But if I fall in love and want to share it, that's perversion, and it must be persecuted and punished. Well, in 2017, to mark 50 years since that landmark sermon, it was repeated by the Reverend Annette Cater And at the end, she blessed the rainbow banners that you can see here in the church. And some of these banners included ones that were made from materials given to her by her mother, who makes clergy vestments. Reverend Cater said in her blessing, "We know that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in it. And God said, 'It is good,' all of it. And so, in that spirit, may these banners be a symbol of that all-encompassing, generous, amazing, unending love for all, that all who see it may be overwhelmed by the power of that love and know, God, that you are a God of love."
It's a really lovely church. If you haven't been inside, it's a really lovely church to go in. It's got this lovely warm wood, intimate feel. Yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. Okay, we're going to move to our next stop, which is just a bit further up Willis Street. And so we're on the red dot at the moment, and we're going to the yellow dot. And that yellow dot is where once was Baptist House, and now it's called Strategy House. And years ago, there was a Bible shop on the ground floor, and apparently a lot of Russian seamen would come in and buy their Bibles at the store. But now it hosts a variety of organisations. On the second floor is the Lesbian Library, Lilac, and we'll talk about that just in a minute. But on the first floor is the New Zealand AIDS Foundation Athena Centre, and the Athena Centre not only offers testing for HIV, syphilis and other STIs, but also offers some counselling services as well. But this is not the first location of Athena. It was originally in Newtown, and it kind of was established in the late 1980s. It's not the first HIV clinic centre in New Zealand. The first was actually in Auckland, and it's called the Burnett Center. And this is a lovely photo of Bruce Burnett, who it was named after. So if we go back to the early 1980s, it was 1981 in the US when the CDC started putting out reports saying that there were these clusters of young gay men that were getting really rare cases of pneumonia, and that was 1981. It wasn't until 1983 that we actually had our first AIDS-related death in New Zealand, and so we were a good 2 to 3 years behind what was happening in the US. Well, somebody that was in the US was Bruce Burnett. He was originally from Auckland, and he moved to Europe, and then he moved to San Francisco in 1982. And in 1982, he was volunteering as part of the Shanti Project in San Francisco, and so this offered both emotional and practical support for people with chronic illnesses, including those that had AIDS. In 1984, Bruce came back to New Zealand, and he single-handedly started a one-person road trip around New Zealand, trying to educate at-risk communities about AIDS. And in Palmerston North, he held a workshop and then publicly came out as somebody who had AIDS. And that was really courageous at the time, because there was so much kind of stigma and discrimination going on. You know, people were saying things like, oh, you know, if you go in the same swimming pool, or if you eat food, you know, you'll get AIDS with someone else. So all of that's completely untrue, and but this is the stuff that Bruce was having to deal with. And Bruce not only did this roadshow, but also went on to national media and talked really passionately about safer sex practices. So along with this this road trip that Bruce was doing, he was also with other people forming the AIDS Support Network, which was established. It was a community-driven network, and it was there to offer support to people. So that was being formed in 1984. So Bruce worked right up until a couple of weeks before he died. So he finished work in May 1985, and he died in the 1st of June 1985 at the age of 30. And so this year would be his 35th anniversary of his death. But remarkable that he worked right up until, pretty much up until he passed away. After his passing, the AIDS Support Network got funding from the Ministry of Health, and this is where the New Zealand AIDS Foundation was born, and so the AIDS Support Network morphed into the New Zealand AIDS Foundation. And it's really lovely that the AIDS Foundation still has the name of Bruce on their Burnett clinic up in Auckland. Just the getting back to Lilac, the Lesbian Library on the 2nd floor. Now that was built in, well that was established in 1994. It's been in a variety of locations. It's completely volunteer led and run, and it is the largest single accessible collection of lesbian articles and books in New Zealand, and it's remarkable that as a collective it's been able to go since 1984, which is really fantastic. Okay, we are going to our next stop now, and our next stop is just a bit further up Willis Street. We're at the red dot, and we're going across to the yellow dot, which is just a bit north.
So this is the Willis Street Village, which was designed in the late 1970s by the Wellington architect Roger Walker. It was the 4th and final location for the Dorian Society. Now, we mentioned the Dorians just a little bit earlier. The Dorian Society here occupied a space just at the back. You can't quite see it from this image, in the top left-hand corner, and it was there until from when the village opened to the Dorian Society closed in 1988. The Dorian Society was established in 1962, and it was the first New Zealand organisation for homosexual men, although homosexuality wasn't mentioned in the club rules or minutes. Its objective was to promote among its members an honest desire to serve the development of friendship, mutual respect, and tolerance in all its aspects. But it was primarily a private social club that avoided political action. But in 1963, it took the first steps in New Zealand towards law reform by forming a legal subcommittee that collected books and other resources, and directly from this was formed the New Zealand Homosexual Law Reform Society. Now, the Dorian Club had a number of different locations around Wellington, including on Lambton Quay down by Cable Car Lane. It had an all-male policy for some time. Lesbians couldn't be members or even guests at the beginning, but by the time it was here at the Willis Street Village, it was open to all members. Also in the Willis Street Village was a lesbian-owned and operated private club called Outrage, and that was here from 1991 until 1993. And so now let's move to our second to last stop.
Second to last stop, yes. 2 more stops. Yep. And here we are on the red dot, and we're going just up to the yellow dot. Now that is where the Majestic Centre is now, and that's a shot of the street view. So what we're actually going to be talking about is the Pollen House, which is this lovely wooden building on the corner in the centre of the shot, but also about Bulcott Chambers. And Bulcott Chambers no longer exists, but it was a real magnet and a hub for rainbow activism in the 70s and 80s. And in this shot, we have the Pollen House, which is now on the corner, but was originally a bit further up the street. That's on the left. And then on the right, we have Bulcott Chambers. And Bulcott Chambers had a whole variety of rainbow community organisations. It was the site of the Women's Resource Centre, the Hecate Women's Health Collective, and the Gay Community Centre. On the 3rd floor was the Lesbian Center, which was the first of its kind in New Zealand. It was set up in November 1980. And also on the 3rd floor was the Lesbian and Gay Rights Resource Centre. And so the purpose of the Resource Centre was to gather information around homosexual law reform, around health, legal issues, human rights, and just as a way of collecting and disseminating information, and also being a hub of activist activity. So not only was it a hub, it was also a target for arson, and it was targeted twice for arson, once in October 1985, and that was before homosexual law reform had passed. And this image here is actually from the 11th of September 1986, and it shows Phil Parkinson, who also was involved in setting up the AIDS support network, and Phil was involved with the resource centre and looking through the damage. And this arson was done. The arsonists were never found, and they twinked fag onto the wooden floor before they left. So there was an idea of, you know, what was annoying them.
Mm. Well, that old wooden house, which we see in the back of there, was the Pollen House, as we mentioned. It was moved down to the corner of the site there, just after law reform in the late 1980s. The house was that of Dr. Pollen, and it was his home and surgery. Now, he actually died there in 1918 after contracting influenza during the influenza pandemic following the First World War. Dr. Pollen was the Wellington Port Health Officer, and it's believed he contracted the virus while inspecting overseas ships in Wellington Harbour. His wife Catherine had died earlier in 1894, but he lived in the house here with his two daughters, Dorothy and Effie. Now, Effie was born in 1879 and is mainly remembered these days for her long-term relationship with the famous New Zealand poet Ursula Bethel. That relationship lasted over 30 years. Here's a lovely photo of Ursula and cat.
It's a very large cat, isn't it?
A very large cat. So the two met in London in 1905, and they lived overseas for many years, not returning to New Zealand to live until they were in their 40s. When Pollen returned to New Zealand, Bethel followed, and there's a suggestion that for a time they might have lived together in the Pollen House there on the corner of Willis and Cuba Streets. But certainly by 1919 they were living together in Christchurch at a place called Rhys Cottage, and here's a great image of the interior of Rhys Cottage. Effie kept house and supported Ursula so that Ursula could write, and in fact Bethel wrote most of her poetry during this period, describing their home and garden and life together, and Bethel called Pollen her little raven. Now, even though they lived together, they were at pains to travel separately on public transport so as not to arouse suspicion. Now, while they guarded their privacy, they did invite friends to visit, including members of the Rainbow community like the artist Toss Wollaston and the poet Charles Brash and Walter Darcy Cresswell. Now, a few days after Bethel's birthday, her 60th birthday, Pollen complained of severe headaches, and so she went to bed and sadly died there 3 days later of a brain hemorrhage. The distraught Bethel wrote openly of her grief for Pollen in letters and in 6 memorial poems that were written on the anniversaries of Pollen's death. In the sixth poem, the final one, called Spring 1940, she asks God to match spring with vision. Spirit of beauty, bring with your persuasive love to the inward eye awakening, lest looking on this life to count what time has taken, I cannot bear the pain. It's a sad poem, really. Now, Effie is buried in Maori Cemetery, and also quite sadly, I think Ursula is buried not with Effie, but buried in North Canterbury.
Just before we leave this kind of area, I just want to show you one really interesting photograph we found when we were working out this tour. But to do that, we just need to skip location a little bit. So we're at the red dot, and we're going to cross over to the west of us, kind of. This is going to Perrott's Corner, which is literally just across the road. And here we are. So the red dot is obviously the Pollen House. and the yellow dot is Parrott's Corner. And the interesting thing when we started doing this tour was that we came across a photograph from the 1860s, and just remember where that yellow dot is now. We'll go to the 1860s and we're on the yellow dot, so the yellow dot is Parrott's Corner. And what struck us about this photograph was how close you are to the waterfront. Literally, you are just a block away from Wellington Harbour. If you know Wellington, you'll know that it's really been infilled over the last 100 years. And so where there is water in that photograph, we now have things like Civic Square, Te Papa,
Public Library.
the public library. And it's just quite remarkable to see the kind of natural harbour in 1860s. Well, we're going to go to our last stop now, and oh, we've already been thanked. We haven't finished yet. You can't leave.
We're nearly there.
We've still got one more stop. No, stop! Don't leave us. Okay, our last stop is right here. We're going from Parrott's Corner, the red dot, to the yellow dot, which is on Victoria and Manor Street. And the building we're talking about is where that Amazon surf building is there now.
So that site was the site of one of Henry Britton's pharmacies. Now, Henry Britton arrived in Wellington from Auckland in the 1870s with his family. He established a number of pharmacies around Wellington, one on Lambton Quay, and then this one, which is called the Taro Dispensary in 1876. It was affectionately known as the pillbox because it had an octagonal shape, and you can't really see the octagon shape in this photo, but if you see one sort of a modern photo looking down there, you can see it's more sort of triangular, but it has a few more sides than a triangle. That interesting shape gave it its nickname, the pillbox. Now, if you'd popped in there for a medicinal remedy, you may well have spoken to a young Robert Gant, who was Britton's apprentice there for 4 years before he moved to Masterton in 1882. Now, Robert Gant loved photography and theatre, and he also had a long career as a female impersonator, taking the stage name Cecil Riverton. Cecil is on the right there in this photo. Now, this the Evening Post, I should say. The Evening Post is what I want to say, declared Cecil as achieving a pronounced success in the part of Little Buttercup in the 1881 production of HMS Pinafore.
But I think it's, well, probably it's Robert's photography from the late 1800s that still really does resonate with us today. So Robert's visual interests included young men, sailors, shoes. He had a bit of a thing for execution scenarios. So at the time there was a thing about beheadings, theatrical beheadings, which were interesting. He moved up to around the Masterton area, just north of Wellington. This is the 1880s, 1890s, and these are some photographs that he took. So as a chemist, he could develop his own photography. This is an image with actually Robert being in the centre. He's the one resting his head on the head. There's another image here. Robert is the one being kissed, so Robert's not the one with the hat, but just really unambiguous imagery.
Amazing for that time.
When you think this is rural New Zealand in the 1880s and 1890s. And here are a lovely couple of images of Charlie Hay. And so Charlie Hay was the son of the Greytown butcher. And not only did he get photographed by Robert, but they developed and had a relationship. And in 1905, around 1905, they moved back to Wellington and actually lived in Seatoun in Wellington for over 25 years together. And one of the really lovely things with this story is that all these images come from 2 photo albums that Robert kept, and then they were passed on to Charlie, and through Charlie they were passed through the Hay family, and subsequently, ultimately, deposited with the Alexander Turnbull Library here in Wellington. So it's that wonderful kind of going down through the family and being passed to a national institution. And you think of all the moments in time when those photographs could have been destroyed, the albums could have been thrown out, but they weren't, and the images were taken, and it's a wonderful entry into rural New Zealand 1880s in terms of our rainbow heritage. And what a lovely kind of place to end. And this is the end. This is the end. Thank you. Thank you so much for sticking with us over the last 50 minutes. We really hope that you've enjoyed this walk tour through Wellington. We are doing these on a monthly basis. We've got a number of tours that we do, and our next tour is going to be on Sunday the 7th of June at 1 o'clock. And we're going to be doing the Violet Walk, I think it's the Violet Walk tour. We're going from Parliament down onto the terrace and then down onto the waterfront. So quite different stories. Please feel free to join us. And again, these will be available on YouTube after the live stream as well, so that they can be shared and commented on. If you have any suggestions, please feel free to get in contact with us at walks@taonga.nz. And just one final thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Hope to see you soon.
And thank you to Alice and Laurie and you.
That's probably what I meant to say. The important thing is, as well as thanking you, is Dr. Alice and Laurie and Hugh Young for their research.
Yes. So thank you. Have a lovely afternoon. Really looking forward to a haircut. Hope it happens this week.
You might see.
You might see. Have a lovely afternoon. Bye.
Okay.